Putin thought Europe was weak, but now he's watching the continent arm faster than at any point since World War II, and it's paralyzing it. Germany is pledging up to 5% of its GDP for defense. Poland is racing to 4.7%. France, the UK and others are ramping up hard power at breakneck speed. What started as a Russian invasion of Ukraine has triggered something Putin never expected. Europe is waking up and getting ready to fight. Now, Western intel officials say Putin is concerned, scrambling for leverage, and already showing signs of hesitation as a new military giant rises on his doorstep. So how did this happen, and what does it mean for the future of the war? Let's break it down. On May 22nd, Times Radio spoke to John Loff about this very issue. Loff serves as the new Eurasian Strategy Centre's head of foreign policy and spent 7 years serving as NATO's first representative in Moscow, meaning he knows how Putin thinks better than most. And right now, he suggests Putin is dealing with a crisis with Europe that he never anticipated when he began his invasion of Ukraine. We get early signs of this from some of the actions that Putin has taken in recent weeks. Take the May 21st assassination of former Ukrainian official Andriy Portnov in Madrid as an example. Portnov served as an advisor to former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych and was an extremely controversial figure. According to the Kyiv Independent, Portnov alternated between living in Ukraine and other countries following Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution. He was also subjected to US sanctions in 2021 amid claims he was involved in corruption within Ukraine's judiciary. Now he's dead. Shot down at 9:15 a.m. in Madrid, Portnov died as a result of 5 gunshots, 3 of which struck him in the head and torso. It appears Portnov was a controversial figure in Ukraine, Loff tells Times Radio. He is believed to have wielded in recent years great influence over the judiciary in Ukraine, and he, of course, was perceived as a holdover from the days of Viktor Yanukovych. Loff points out that Portnov was the man who configured much of the legislation that allowed Ukraine to become so corrupt that Putin was able to conduct his first campaign of aggression against the country. Loff suggests the assassination may have been due to a business dispute, but just as possible is that Portnov had outlived his usefulness to Putin. Russia's leader may have ordered his assassination in Madrid, both to get him out of the way and to send a message to a major European power. Russia can conduct operations in your country. Perhaps Putin is getting desperate. Loff also notes that Putin's recent talks with US President Donald Trump offer signs of a Russian president who's now starting to grow worried about Europe. My view is that Putin is actually under more pressure than it appears from the outside. The Kremlin presents this narrative that the Russian army is advancing in Ukraine. Ukraine is about to be rolled over and Russia will achieve its war goals, Loff says. That really isn't the case. Therein lies the reason why Putin is taking Trump's calls. The narrative Russia presents to the rest of the world, specifically to Europe, is false, Loff seems to suggest. Putin is now looking for other ways to bring his campaign to an end. By talking to Trump, he's hoping to manipulate the US into withdrawing military support. That's a distinct possibility. It's possible that the US may approve no new aid packages and will instead offer bits and pieces of support, such as providing military intelligence. That's what Putin wants. However, his desperation to get the US to pull away is coming back to bite him for a simple reason. Russia's leader is now being paralyzed by an explosive rise in military power. We'll explain how in a moment, but let's first dig into the reality of the situation on the ground in Putin's Ukraine invasion. When talking about the Kremlin's narrative that Russia is advancing in Ukraine, Loff notes that this advance is nowhere near as quick as Putin claims. It is of course true that the Russian army is advancing, Loff says, but it's advancing very slowly. Loff isn't wrong. In April, Russia only managed to capture around 67 square miles of Ukrainian territory, according to analysts from Deep State. The UK's Ministry of Defense painted a slightly rosier picture for Putin, stating that Russia claimed 77 square miles of Ukraine, advancing at a rate of a little over 2 miles per day. However, Putin made those advances while sacrificing over 1,000 of his soldiers daily to Ukraine's defenses, along with losing vast quantities of military equipment. The point Loff is making is that pressure is starting to tell on Putin. He's sacrificing too much to sustain even the meager advances Russia is making, and that's only opening the door for the European military revival to put Russia's leader back in his place. Putin is well aware of this fact. As Loff notes, he's talking to Trump now because this slow rate of advance is being combined with what Putin can see on the horizon. Putin at the same time can see that there's a possibility that Europe will be able to keep Ukraine armed and perhaps even motivated to continue fighting. That's a problem for Putin. Even operating under the assumption that the US may dramatically scale back the aid it's providing to Ukraine under Trump, Putin has to deal with a resurgent Europe, piling pressure onto his position as Russia's leader. And that's far from the only pressure Putin faces. Loft notes that Russia's economy may be able to withstand the pressure being caused by Western sanctions for a couple more years. However, that's not the primary internal problem Putin faces. There are other bottlenecks, Loft points out. The defense industry is struggling to produce certain types of equipment that are being wiped out on the battlefield. That creates a massive challenge for Russia. Loft notes that if Putin intends to go deeper into Ukraine, he'll need to massively increase the size of Russia's army. That would mean one thing: mobilization. Putin doesn't want that. The last time he tried a partial mobilization was in September 2022, when the Ukrainians were in fact moving forward at some speed, and it really looked as though the Russian army was getting into trouble. He mobilized 300,000 reservists from across Russia, and about 1 million people in response left the country. While some of those million later returned, Loft says, these abandonments suggest while Russia's people may outwardly express support for Putin's war, it wasn't enthusiastic about it 3 years ago, and has grown no more enthusiastic about it in the years since. Yet more pressure is being piled onto Putin. And it's this pressure that's starting to paralyze. Putin is not sure of what he can achieve on the battlefield because this is taking a long time, Loft points out. The Russian army is simply grinding forward, and it does have the strategic advantage just by virtue of numbers of men and equipment. But it's a slow and painful process. These problems are compounded by the fact that Putin doesn't know what he'll get out of engaging in the diplomatic process Trump is attempting to foist upon him. He wants to try to get to a peace agreement eventually, or at least tie Ukraine into a negotiation on a peace agreement. Putin's problem is that the diplomatic process that the peace agreement would entail isn't going as he wanted. That brings us back to our 2-hour phone call with Trump that we mentioned earlier. Loft believes that Putin's statement following that call is far more revealing than Russia's leader would have liked it to be. He stood in front of the cameras, and you can just see from the way he was holding his head that he was thinking really hard. He wasn't reading a script, and he was trying to find a set of words to describe the outcome of his phone call and what the next steps would be, Loft tells Times Radio. That's strange for Putin. Russia's leader is usually a man who exercises extreme control over everything, both in terms of the people with whom he surrounds himself and the messages that come out of the Kremlin. Loft suggests that Putin seemed like a man struggling to define his next step in the wake of his call with Trump, and that led to the first real signs of fear that Putin has displayed since he began his invasion. The one really interesting thing he said was that both sides, and we'd never heard this before during the war, both sides have to be prepared to make compromises, Loft says. Though he is slightly summarizing the specific words Putin used by his own admission, Loft points out that this is a massive turnaround for Russia's leader. In the past, and even during the most recent ceasefire negotiations, Putin has spoken about dealing with the root cause of the Ukraine. That roughly translated to Russia wanting to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign entity while absorbing the country into the Russian Federation. Now Putin seems to be talking differently. The combined pressures we've just mentioned are a factor. Russia's leader can see that his forces aren't making the gains he needs them to make in Ukraine. He also knows that he faces pressure from Trump, and that Russia is increasingly struggling under the weight of Western sanctions. Throw a faltering defense industry into the mix, along with the prospect of being forced to mobilize if he wants to claim more of Ukraine, and it seems that Putin may be more ready for peace than he would like to let on. So ready, in fact, that he's becoming paralyzed in his decision-making. So paralyzed that he doesn't seem to know where to go next. Sure, he looks set to start a new summer offensive. However, Putin knows that new offensive won't get him what he wants out of his invasion, which is why he's balancing that offensive with talks about both sides having to compromise. But there's something else. Something much bigger that is pushing Putin deeper into his paralysis. We mentioned it at the start of the video, and it's the primary reason why Putin is struggling to find his next move. The Ukraine invasion has led to a massive European power surge that has the potential to sustain Ukraine for several more years, while leaving Putin with no chance of expanding deeper into Europe should his invasion ultimately succeed. Putin wants to know, I think, whether Europe is really going to rearm and whether Russia is going to now have to face Europe as a sort of significant factor on the continent, and one that can project not just soft power and economic power, as Europe has done successfully for decades, but can really amass hard power and indeed threaten to use it, Loft says. Perhaps there's no wanting to know about it. Putin is being forced to watch as Europe puts measures in place to amass that hard power. Loft offers an example. The announcement last week that Germany by 2032 might be spending up to 5% of its GDP or gross domestic product on defense is nothing short of sensational, he says. And Loft isn't wrong. Germany has been signaling this intent for several weeks, with its foreign minister, Johann Wadephul, stating for the first time on May 15th that Germany planned to follow Trump's suggestion that NATO nations should be spending 5% of their GDP on defense. "We are following him there," came Wadephul's simple statement. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius offered some clarification a few days later, stating, "It's not about 5% in 1 year. The most important thing is to start and to fulfill the NATO requirements." Pistorius says the push to 5% is needed because Germany simply won't be able to meet NATO capability goals, even with a defense budget of 3% of its GDP. It needs to spend more. Europe needs to spend more. And that news is only feeding into the paralysis that Putin already feels when it comes to the Ukraine war. It's especially devastating for Putin because he likely saw Germany, which is one of Europe's most powerful nations, as a soft touch. As Loft points out, Germany is currently hovering around the 2% mark, which is NATO's recommended amount of GDP expenditure on defense. Before Putin's invasion, Germany was spending far less than 2% of its GDP on its military. 2024 saw the first time the country hit 2% in years, says Reuters, and it's only going to spend more from there. This is the biggest economy in Europe. It's the third biggest economy in the world. So if Germany is going down that road and other countries follow, at least to some degree, then European defense might look very different. The news for Putin is simple. Europe's dominant economic power, perhaps for the first time since the end of World War II, is going to focus on building a powerful military. Russia's leader never saw this coming, and it's one of the main reasons why he's now bouncing around looking for different ways to end the Ukraine war. And it's only going to get worse from here. Loft mentions that other European nations may follow Germany on the path to 5% of GDP spending. That hasn't happened yet. However, other major European powers are offering plenty of signs that they too recognize the threat Russia poses, and they are increasing their defense expenditure accordingly. Take Poland as an example. In February, the country's Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced that Poland would spend 4.7% of its GDP on defense in 2025. That's just shy of 5%, and it's happening a lot faster than Germany's proposed 7-year journey to get to the 5% mark. That increased spending will raise Poland's military budget to around $34 billion, and is being accompanied by the construction of a new anti-missile base on Polish territory. In the UK, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer laid out his own plans in February. He says that the UK is planning to increase its defense spending commitment to 2.5% of its GDP from April 2027. Beyond that, who knows? If Putin continues to threaten Europe, there's a good chance the UK will follow Germany and Poland's lead by promising even more defense spending in the future. France, which along with the UK is one of Europe's only nuclear powers, is also committed to increasing its defense spending. It currently allocates 2% of its GDP to defense. However, French President Emmanuel Macron has claimed that his goal is to raise that spending to 3.5%, which will add an extra $34 billion annually. In France's case, Macron's goal clashes with the need to reduce public spending. Still, the fact that Macron would publicly state that France should spend more despite its internal budget problems is yet another sign to Putin that Europe is getting very serious about the Russian threat. Expand the scope to the rest of Europe, and military spending is higher than ever before. That's according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, which says that Europe, including Russia, collectively spent $693 billion on defense in 2024. That amounted to a 17% increase compared to 2023. Out of that $693 billion, Russia accounted for $149 billion, SIPRI claims. That means Europe is already outspending Russia to the tune of $544 billion per year, and it's only going to be spending more from here on out. Add to all of this a series of new sanctions being placed on Russian oil interests. On May 20th, the European Union announced and adopted its 17th sanctions package, which targets Russia's energy revenues, Putin's shadow fleet of ships, and key military technology that Russia is using to fight against Ukraine. An 18th package is already in the works, Pravda reveals, which will disconnect 20 Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system and ban the Nord Stream gas pipe. It's all more pressure that's paralyzing Putin. With a formidable array of sanctions now in place against Russia, more sanctions added this week by both the European Union and the UK, and possibly more meaningful sanctions actually because they're starting to try to go after Russia's oil revenues. Loft notes about these developments. He claims that Russia is being increasingly isolated from the West, especially Europe, at a time when the European continent is building up the hard power it needs to confront Putin. This is a very unnatural posture for Russia to be so alienated from Europe and so dependent on China at the same time. So for Putin, the balance sheet is not particularly positive at the moment. All of these European problems for Putin feed into what Loft claims Russia's leader wants to do. I think he wants to shift quite radically, and I believe bring this war to an end. Europe's growing military is much more than the straw that's breaking Putin's back. It's practically a log that, when combined with sanctions and how draining the Ukraine war has been for Russia, has left Putin's back broken and Russia paralyzed as it tries to figure out how to dig itself out of the hole its leader created for it. All of which brings us to our final question. What is Putin's next move from here? Work on the memorandum of peace Putin promised to create during his phone call with Trump is the first port of call. Loft speculates that this memorandum will see probably a bit more constructive Russian language around that, as Putin tries to test to see if Europe is really preparing to stifle him with its massive military spending. However, Putin may be looking at another solution to his newfound paralysis: getting the hell out of Dodge. As Loft says, Putin has been talking about the need to find a successor more now than he has done at any point in the past. I watched an interview with him recently where he was saying he thinks about the issue of a successor constantly, Loft tells Times Radio. So that would suggest that this is very much on his mind, and maybe that he thinks he's going to get to the end of the current presidential term and then move on. That term ends in 2030, right around the time when Germany will be approaching 5% of GDP expenditure on defense. Perhaps that's Putin's new plan. No longer able to achieve success in Ukraine and paralyzed by the rising military power of Europe, he wants to negotiate a peace framework that makes him look good at home so he can ride off into the sunset. He'll just be doing it after his own actions broke Russia's back to the point where his successor has to deal with a far more powerful Europe than ever before. But what do you think about Loft's comments and what they may mean in the context of Europe emerging as a power capable of taking on Russia? Will we ever see a war between Russia and Europe? Is Putin going to push for peace now that he sees he's in a dire situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war.